Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. On Thursday, March 6 of 1873, one of the most shocking and nefarious double murders in all of New England history took place on an island just 6 miles off the rocky coast of Maine. Stay with us and hear the true story of the Smutty-Nose Island Murders on this all-new episode of Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is our Stories from Maine weekly podcast for the 4th week of March, 2025. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. You can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And now, you can also find Stories from Maine on TikTok. Now, let's head over to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
In this segment of This Week in Maine History, we visit April 1st of 1968, when Dow Army Air Base in Bangor officially closes. The airbase had been an active military installation since 1940, and was most active during World War II. The city of Bangor soon takes over the former military installation, and by 1969, converts the base for civilian use. Today, the former Dow Air Force Base operates as the Bangor International Airport. Now, let's head over to Oscar for our feature story.
On Thursday, March 6 of 1873, one of the most shocking and nefarious double murders in all of New England history took place on an island just 6 miles off the rocky coast of Maine. Louis Wagner was a 28-year-old immigrant from Prussia who was a tenant in the Johnson boarding house at 25 Water Street in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He took on a lot of odd jobs and usually worked on boats as a fisherman. Although he was a hard worker, he never seemed to save a dime. But he had a taste for better things and a desire to live well beyond his means. On that infamous day, Wagner had mentioned to another fisherman that his shoes were falling apart. His clothing was worn and seriously threadbare, and he was now 3 weeks behind in his rent payments to Mrs. Brown. Wagner wanted to leave Portsmouth to go somewhere else and start over, but he also knew he would need a good deal of money to do so. Maine and New Hampshire share a border, and lying just 6 miles off the coast of Portsmouth, in Maine waters, lies the Isles of Shoals. This group of islands and ledges has been inhabited for hundreds of years. In 1873, a total of nearly 60 people were scattered over these islands. On one of the largest of these islands lived the Honfet family. The Honfets were a Scandinavian fishing family that had settled in the old Haley house on Smutty-Nose Island. This family of fishermen owned their own fishing boat, the Clarabelle, and these Honfets had often hired Louis Wagner to work on their boat. They also offered him a place to live there on the island while he worked for the family. They fed him at their table, he slept under their roof, and the Honfets treated Wagner as a friend. When Louis Wagner sized up his poor situation that day, he firmly decided that something had to be done to alter his miserable situation and allow him to leave Portsmouth to better his life. As evening came on, Wagner noticed the Clarabelle was docked in port at New Hampshire, and the Honfet men were busy that night preparing the boat, loading bait, and offloading their day's catch. Wagner then went into a bar and had a stiff drink or two and divined his plan. Within the hour, Wagner stole a small dory boat and made his way out to Smutty-Nose Island. He knew the Honfet men were busy for the night on the mainland, and he knew that meant the Honfet women were all alone on Smutty-Nose Island. By midnight, Wagner had arrived on the island, and he was sure that the Honfets kept a great deal of cash in their house. Wagner intended to liberate that cash from this kind and generous Scandinavian family. But first he had to deal with the 3 women who were in the house. After walking the island and summoning the courage, Wagner then entered the house through an unlocked front door. He immediately startled one of the women who was fast asleep on the couch. As he approached 38-year-old Karen Christensen, she awoke, recognized Wagner, and called out his name. Wagner then picked up a wooden chair and began beating her over the head. She began to scream his name over and over in stunned surprise, as Wagner continued to strike away. Finally, one last blow with the chair had knocked Karen out. It also knocked over a clock and froze the time at 1:07 a.m. Upstairs, Anithi Christensen and Maren Honfet were awoken by Karen's screaming. Anithi had made it to the bottom of the stairs, just in time to witness Wagner deliver the final knockout blow to her sister Karen. Maren then joined Anithi and the two were quickly noticed by Wagner. Anithi tried to run as Wagner gave chase. Maren then ran out the front door, while Anithi was cornered. Anithi then turned to a closed window and opened it. As she tried to climb out, Louis Wagner caught up to her and began striking her with a broken portion of the chair, which he swung like a club. The blows he landed were painfully killing Anithi while her body was caught halfway through the opening. Then, as her body hung in the open window, Wagner walked through the house and out the front door. As he walked around the outside of the house, Wagner saw an axe rested against the building, which he grabbed up as he walked by. He then rounded the corner to the open window where Anithi lay bleeding and screaming. Wagner then began to swing the axe. After more than a half-dozen vicious blows, Anithi was finally dead. Wagner was covered in her blood and Anithi's lifeless body remained slumped over the windowsill. Wagner then tugged on Anithi's remains and let her bloody body fall to the white, snow-covered ground. Wagner then grabbed Anithi's ankle and dragged her mutilated remains back into the kitchen of the house. As Maren made a panicked run into the woods, Wagner returned to Karen, who was still unconscious on the couch. He still had the axe in his hand, and he began swinging it once again. While his renewed assault on Karen continued, Karen's screams also continued. Meanwhile, Maren made her barefoot run across the ice and snow-covered ground, while her ears filled with the echoes of Karen's blood-curdling screams. After many whacks with the axe, Karen was still not dead, and as Wagner repeatedly swung again and again, when suddenly the handle of the axe snapped off in Wagner's hand. Wagner tossed down the axe handle and finished Karen off by strangling the life from her bloody body. Both Anithi and Karen were now dead, and he dragged Karen's body from the couch to the kitchen and placed her bloody corpse on the cold kitchen floor alongside Anithi. Wagner then grabbed a cloth from the kitchen table and some water from the sink, and he started to clean himself of his victim's blood, which was now splattered over his face, hands, and clothes. We'll be right back.
We hope you are enjoying this episode of our free podcast. Please help us in bringing you more episodes by liking, subscribing, following, and commenting on our Stories from Maine content on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify. Your interaction allows us to keep our podcast free for all to enjoy. Now, let's go back to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
In this next segment of This Week in Maine History, we revisit March 30th of 1937, when the official Pine Tree Song is adopted by the Maine legislature. The tune was written by Roger Vinton Snow. This official song is still the official state song for the great state of Maine. Take a listen.
Grand state of Maine, proudly we sing, to tell your glories to the land, to shout your praises till the echoes ring. Should Maine unkind
Now, let's return to Oscar for more of our feature story.
Back on Smutty-Nose Island, Wagner had finished cleaning himself of the evidence of his murderous spree, and he tossed a few logs onto the red-hot coals of the kitchen stove. As the fire blazed, Wagner put on the kettle. He knew he still had one witness left to eliminate, as she could identify him. But he also knew she wasn't going anywhere. As Wagner stared down at the two bloody and mutilated women, who now lay lifeless at his feet, on the cold kitchen floor, he suddenly became hungry. Once the kettle was ready, Wagner made himself some hot tea and had some cold leftovers of food, plus crackers, bread, and jam. He was now cleaned up and had filled his stomach. It was nearing 2 a.m. and he still had one woman left to kill before the night was over. But first, he wanted the money that he came for. Wagner began searching the house for the huge amount of cash he imagined was there. Meanwhile, Maren Huntvet had made her way to the edge of the island. She had her small dog with her and she was in a nightgown, but had no shoes on her feet. The ground was covered in snow and a frigid sea wind was blowing. She grabbed up her small dog and held him to her chest as she took cover in the craggy rocks of the island's edge. All she could do was hide and try not to freeze, then wait for the sun to rise. When Wagner finished tossing the house, all he could find was a total of $20 in cash. It was far, far less than what he wanted, and what he needed, and what he believed he would find. Wagner had completely missed nearly $150 in coin and cash that was well hidden. But it was getting late. He still had one last witness to find and kill before he had to return to the mainland, or risk having his absence noticed. By 7 a.m., Wagner was back at the boarding house in Portsmouth, and he quickly changed his clothes and finished cleaning himself up. He had tried to find Maren Huntvet, but she had evaded his discovery, and Wagner was forced by time to leave the island. Maren and her little dog had survived the night. By 9 a.m., Wagner was on a train headed for Boston, and the Clarabelle was about to make landfall at Smutty-Nose Island. By then, Maren was able to get the attention of people on a nearby island as they awoke and stepped out of doors. She received the help she needed and soon had her husband and family home with her. By noon, the Clarabelle had arrived back in Portsmouth. John Huntvet took his wife Maren to a doctor, while his brother went to the police. Maren clearly identified the killer as Louis Wagner, and since the Huntvets had known him so well, they were able to tell the police a lot about Wagner, including his favorite places to go. By noon, Wagner had gotten off the train and was at large in Boston. His first business was to buy a new pair of shoes and a new suit of clothes. He also went to a barber, where he had his full beard shaved off and had his hair cut. He also changed into his new clothes. He then went to a local bar for a drink and ate lunch. Then Wagner rented a room at a local rooming house, one where he had stayed a few times before, and was well known. We'll be right back.
All new episodes of our Stories from Maine podcasts stream each Saturday on our YouTube and Spotify channels. We also post new content each day on our Stories from Maine Facebook page. So, please help us to keep our podcasts free to all by following or subscribing to us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And you can email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. Now, let's go back to James for another informative segment of This Week in Maine History.
Let's now go back to March 31st of 1907, when West Gardiner, Maine native, John F. Stevens, resigns as the chief engineer of the building of the Panama Canal. In 1905, Stevens was appointed by President Theodore Roosevelt to assume the post of chief engineer, and to continue the daunting job of creating this wondrous marvel of modern engineering. Feeling the position now required someone with other specific and additional qualifications, different from his own, Stevens handed in his resignation. But Stevens' engineering came at a critical point in the canal's planning and building, and his work was vital to the success of the project. The Panama Canal eventually opened on August 15 of 1914. Now, let's head on back to Oscar for the conclusion of our feature story, Murder on Smutty-Nose Island.
By 7 p.m. that night, telegraph lines were hot with messages out of Portsmouth. Louis Wagner was clearly wanted for the murders on Smutty-Nose Island, and Boston police had quickly located him at the boarding house. Louis Wagner was immediately arrested and returned to Portsmouth on the train the very next day. By the time Wagner had arrived at the Portsmouth train station, word of his dastardly deeds on Smutty-Nose Island had spread like wildfire. By the next day, nearly 10,000 people had gathered at the train station, and Boston police had called in a detachment of Marines from the shipyard. With pistols drawn and bayonets forward, the police and Marines held back a seething crowd who all wanted to hang Louis Wagner right there at the train station. Within a short period of time, Louis Wagner morphed from the most wanted man in the United States to one of the best guarded men in New England history. Within the hour, Wagner was back in Portsmouth and locked up in a jail cell. It was soon determined that while a handful of the more southerly of the land masses making up the Isles of Shoals was in Portsmouth's jurisdiction, it was clear that the northernmost Smutty-Nose Island lay in Maine waters. Legal experts and historians all agreed. Smutty-Nose Island, and justice for Wagner's victims, belonged to Maine, as did the responsibility of prosecuting the case against Louis Wagner. By March 11th of 1873, Louis Wagner was transported to Saco, Maine, for his initial court appearance. By the end of the day, Louis Wagner found his new home in a jail cell at Alfred, Maine. Wagner was officially indicted by a York County grand jury in May of that year, and his trial was scheduled for a few weeks later. By June 9th of 1873, the Maine Supreme Judicial Court convened at Alfred, with the Honorable William G. Barrows presiding. The defense team was led by Saco attorney Rufus P. Tapley and Boston's Max Fishaker. The case was tried by Maine Attorney General and future Maine Governor Harris M. Plaisted. 9 days later, on June 18th of 1873, it took the jury less than 1 hour to return a unanimous verdict of guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Yet, Wagner was not done committing crimes. On the morning of June 25th, Wagner had found a way to pick the locks at the Alfred jail, and along with 2 other prisoners, Wagner had escaped and gone on the run. It was unknown just how long Wagner and his cohorts had been gone. When the jailers made their morning rounds, they discovered that dummies had been made and placed in the beds of Wagner and his fellow prisoners, and there was no sign of either of these 3 men. While the usual appeals were being handled through the courts, and clemency was being sought from the governor's office, Wagner was finally located in mid-July, hiding in the town of Farmington at New Hampshire. His fellow prisoners were not located, but Wagner was returned to Maine, and this time he was placed in the Maine State Prison at Thomaston. By September, all of his appeals had been exhausted, and his clemency request of the governor was firmly and clearly denied. Wagner was sentenced to death by hanging, but he had to first serve 1 year in prison. Yet, other legalities also became an issue, and Wagner was allowed to live yet another year of his miserable and imprisoned life. Then, on June 25th of 1875, at the Maine State Prison in Thomaston, Louis Wagner was one of 2 prisoners who were hung by the neck until dead. Louis Wagner was then buried in an unmarked grave at the prison cemetery. This true tale of the double murders on Smutty-Nose Island is a grisly sort of New England folklore, often retold in cemetery tours and to entertain young candy goblins on Halloween night. And now the true story of the 2 Christensen murder victims and their killer Louis Wagner remains as one of the most infamous and nefarious of our murderous stories from Maine.
Our Stories from Maine podcast streams each Saturday, with all new weekly podcast episodes. Until then, please join us, and nearly 40,000 others, by following us on our Facebook page, for daily content from Maine's great history. And please like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast on our YouTube and Spotify channels. You can also find our books, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, The legends continue, as well as all of Laurie Suzanne Dell's books, through all book retailers and on Amazon. All original Stories from Maine content is copyright 2025, with all rights reserved. Stories from Maine is a registered trademark of Laurie Suzanne Dell. You may contact Stories from Maine by emailing storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. See you next week, and thank you for listening.